This is chapter review of Chapter 3, Perception. What you see is what you get. The main points of this chapter are the perception process, influences on perception, common tendencies in perception, perception checking, empathy, cognitive complexity, and communication. And then there's a summary at the end which kind of pulls it all together. I think the most important part of this chapter is the perception process. As people, we make a lot of generalizations and stereotypes without really meaning to. And some of the things that we don't notice in others are things that others would consider really important. For example, if someone is an artist, they might notice a painting on a wall that's new compared to someone who's a florist might not notice the artwork but notice the little details of flowers in it. I think this is interesting because it shows how we perceive differently than others may perceive the same exact thing. We organize our perceptions in a useful way so that we can examine things like selection, organization, interpretation, and negotiation. With selection, we notice some things and ignore others. Like if our friend gets a new haircut and a new hair color, we might only notice the color and not the cut. Organization, in the chapter, there's this great picture that I'm sure we've all seen with the vase-face comparison, where it's an optical illusion where there's a picture of a vase and a picture of two faces, and both are in different contrasting colors. And whether you focus on the light or the dark area will determine whether you see the vase or the faces. It's interesting because it shows some people may notice one and not the other, or some may notice one first and then the other. It's just interesting to see how people perceive these. I found that with the stereotyping, this was actually kind of difficult for me, because instead of completing the sentences with what my stereotype or generalization may be, I found that I was trying to define them. Like, for example, women are female, and men are males, and Muslims are religious. So that was a little different for me because I didn't have a term that came to mind, just a definition, which was usually one or two words. So I couldn't find myself stereotyping, which I guess is a good thing, but it made it hard for the exercise. The examples of the sentences are: women are blank, men are blank, Republicans are blank. I was trying to figure out whether that one was donkey or elephant, because I was going off of which one was represented by which. But I couldn't remember, so I just left it as Republicans are human. Vegetarians are blank. Mine was, I converted are to do, and I put vegetarians do eat vegetables. Muslims are blank, and older people are blank. I put elderly. In the chapter, though, one of the examples that they give is that some people think of elderly people as having a hard time hearing and not being mentally alert. So because of this generalization, when people run into someone who is elderly, they might look at the person, and instead of looking at them as just a person in general, they may try and talk to them louder or slower so that they can understand and hear. And if the elderly person doesn't have trouble hearing and is mentally alert, they might become annoyed because they're being perceived in a generalized manner instead of in a way that actually fits who they are as a person. I thought the exercise was interesting where it was done that a man was promised a hotel room over the phone and is later denied the room when he shows up in person. To me, this just means that the hotel is full and they overbooked. But in the example, they use 4 race combinations, which is a white perpetrator with a black victim, a white perpetrator with a white victim, a black perpetrator with a white victim, and a black perpetrator with a black victim. In most of the instances, when they did this as a survey, participants were more likely to label the white perpetrator with the black victim as a prejudice issue, where it was thought that if the black victim was turned away, it was most likely due to his race. This was not something that I had thought of or perceived, so it was interesting to see that other people may have thought of this differently. In terms of diversity, Krista Clivington has a socioeconomic stereotyping section where she speaks of how people can perceive her differently, as she is both a 4.0 college student as well as a welfare mom, and she talks about what comes to mind when you hear that description and how people who know her from college treat her differently than people who know her from assistance offices, where they speak to her in condescending and disrespectful tones, as the people that she goes to college with see her as intelligent and ambitious. I thought it was interesting that the same person could be labeled as both unintelligible and intelligent, and have people treat her differently based on how they know her. And it also said that there was a lot of differences with people with different identities. Lynn Manning gives an example where when he's without his cane, he's perceived as just a black man, a burden on society, well, a burden on white society, welfare pimp, rape deranged misogynist, and this is how he perceives people to be perceiving him. But once he pulls out his cane, he transforms into a blind black man, where he's seen as a saintly spirit and a poor motherless child and a disability gimp. I thought it was interesting that his perception of people's perceptions of himself changed so drastically just by this one measure, where he transforms into his blind self from his black self. Punctuation is a really important part of this chapter, where it's thought of where when people are in arguments or trying to solve a conflict, a lot of times what will happen is the person will focus on one area which causes a conflict, and the other will focus on the other area which causes the conflict. An example given is a husband accuses his wife of being too critical, and she states that she's only critical because he's withdrawing from her. His perception is that he's withdrawing because she's critical, and her perception is that she's critical because he's withdrawing. Instead of asking each other what they can do to solve the conflict, they both point fingers at each other for being in the wrong. Interpretation is the way in which we see the events, which goes back to the whole idea of punctuation. If you look at the event in one light, it's hard to see it in the other. So, for example, they gave the invitation of drop by any time to be a literal thing or a figurative thing. Is the person just being polite, or do they really mean go ahead and drop by whenever you want? It's how you interpret that may build or break your relationship with that person. in order to solve all of these conflicts, a big part of it is learning to negotiate with one another. If you're having a conflict with someone, you really need to sit aside and figure out how to solve these differences. The last part that I will touch upon, because I'm over my 10 minutes and I need this to be able to upload to YouTube, is how we as people may perceive each other in different lights, but also how we perceive ourselves. With the example that I gave with Lynn Manning, he's perceiving people to perceive him as being this black, misogynistic, gangbanging rapist because he's black. I'm sure no one's came up to him and told him, hey, you're black, so this is what I think of you. And when he pulls out his cane, he transforms into this blind man, and he sees people as perceiving him as this blind, crippled, disabled burden on the entire population. I'm sure no one's came up to him and told him any of this, and this is how his perceptions of people perceiving him are. You choose to perceive yourself in your own way, and how you label yourself really affects who you think you are in others' eyes. I think the most important takeaway from this whole chapter is that you need to be able to be empathetic to how other people perceive everything. If you can't put yourself in someone else's shoes, it's going to be really hard for you to be able to understand their thoughts and how they're thinking. That's chapter 3 review.